Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. The World Eaters, as a legion, are driven by bloodlust, an uncontrollable rage that defines their every action. But beneath this insatiable thirst for carnage lies a darker, far more tragic connection. The unyielding screams of Angron, their primarch, echoing through their minds. These screams, a manifestation of his eternal suffering, are not only a sign of their torment but also a reflection of their shared fate. The World Eaters are cursed, bound by a chain of madness and pain that links them directly to Angron. His pain is their pain, and no matter how far they may roam across the galaxy, they will always hear his agony. To understand why the World Eaters still hear Angron's screams, we must first understand the man, or rather, the monster, who would become their father. Angron was not always the towering figure of rage and destruction that he is remembered as today. In his earlier life, before his ascension to demonhood, Angron was a gladiator, born in the brutal world of Nuceria. His earliest memories were filled with the screams of his fellow slaves and the brutality of endless bloodshed. Raised in an arena of suffering, Angron was forged in the fires of violence, much as his warriors would later be. But it was not always this way. In his youth, he was a man of honor and pride, but his true nature was twisted by the cruel experiments of his captors. The butcher's nails, those horrific devices implanted in Angron's skull, would define his destiny. These nails, designed to amplify his rage and strip him of any remaining humanity, became his prison. His mind was enslaved by the ceaseless pounding of the nails, driving him into an unrelenting frenzy of violence. They took a once noble warrior and transformed him into a living embodiment of rage, incapable of finding peace or solace. This torment was not just a physical burden. It was a mental and emotional affliction that would scar him for the rest of his existence. But the true horror of the butcher's nails was not just in what they did to Angron, but what they would come to represent for his legion. When the Emperor found Angron, he sought to free him, to bring him into the fold of the Imperium as a leader of men. But Angron's fury was uncontainable, and the Emperor's attempts to remove the butcher's nails were unsuccessful. Angron's fate was sealed, and with it, the fate of the World Eaters. The nails, now embedded deep within his skull, would continue to drive him mad, even as he led his legion into battle. For the World Eaters, the implantation of the butcher's nails was not just a physical transformation, it was a spiritual one. These devices, designed to control Angron, would eventually be implanted in each of his warriors. The World Eaters became a legion of men, forever bound to the same unholy rage that consumed their primarch. It was through these nails that Angron's pain, his torment, became part of them. As the nails drove their minds into madness, they began to hear Angron's screams, echoes of his endless suffering reverberating through their minds. It was a curse that bound them to their primarch, a constant reminder of the horrors he had endured and the price they would pay for their loyalty to him. But the butcher's nails were not the only reason the World Eaters heard Angron's screams. The very nature of their devotion to their primarch created a psychic resonance, a deep connection between the warriors and their father. This bond was not simply a bond of loyalty, it was a bond of shared pain. Angron's suffering became their suffering, and as the World Eaters fought, slaughtering their enemies in the name of Khorne, they could feel the screams of their primarch tearing through their minds. The violence they wrought was not just an act of war. It was an offering, a tribute to the blood-soaked god they worshipped, and a reminder of the eternal pain that defined their existence. In battle, the World Eaters heard these screams louder than ever. Their bloodlust reached its peak as the sounds of Angron's agony mingled with the cries of their enemies. It was as if their primarch's suffering had become a war hymn, one that drove them into ever greater acts of brutality. The battlefields became their temples, and each victory, each death they caused, was another step towards fulfilling the twisted ritual that Angron had set in motion. They reveled in the violence, not because they found joy in it, but because it was the only way they could silence the screams, even if just for a moment. The bloodshed became an addiction, a never-ending cycle that fed the rage within them, and with each new battle, the connection to Angron grew stronger. The suffering of Angron was not just a physical or emotional burden, it was a psychic one as well. The echoes of his pain permeated the minds of his warriors, even after the Horus heresy had ended and the World Eaters had become renegades. Angron's ascension to the rank of Demon Prince of Khorne did little to free him from the torment he had endured. If anything, it amplified it. As a servant of Khorne, Angron was bound to the god of war, forever caught in an endless cycle of rage and bloodshed. His existence was defined by the screams of his own suffering, and this torment became even more intertwined with the World Eaters' fate. They were not simply his soldiers, they were extensions of his madness, each one driven by the same relentless rage that consumed their Primarch. But despite their bond with Angron, the World Eaters were not mindless slaves to his will. There was a tragic irony to their devotion. While they fought in the name of Khorne, they were also trapped by their connection to Angron. They could not escape his screams, no matter how hard they tried. The echoes of his pain reverberated through their minds, pulling them back to their origins, to the gladiator who had suffered endlessly in the pits of Nuceria. The World Eaters may have become demons in their own right, but they were still bound to the suffering that had forged them. And no matter how far they traveled across the galaxy, no matter how many battles they fought, the screams of Angron would always follow them. This unending torment was both a curse and a devotion. The World Eaters had no choice but to carry the weight of their Primarch's pain. They could never escape it, and in some ways, they didn't want to. For all the madness it drove them to, for all the horror it created, there was something deeply tragic about their bond with Angron. They had become like him, creatures of rage and blood, bound to a fate they could not break. They were cursed to hear his screams forever, a reminder that their loyalty had come at a terrible price. The echoes of Angron's suffering were not just a sound, they were a part of their souls, a reminder of the terrible cost of war and devotion. The World Eaters will never escape Angron's screams. It is not simply a matter of time or distance, it is a matter of identity. They are his legacy, and his torment is theirs to bear. In the end, the screams they hear are not just the cries of a Primarch, they are the cries of all those who have suffered in the name of war. And as long as the World Eaters exist, those screams will never fade. Angron's rise to power is rooted in tragedy, and the screams that echo through the minds of the World Eaters are a reflection of this. To understand why they still hear his agonizing cries, we must first look at the events that led to the formation of the World Eaters. When Angron was first discovered by the Emperor, he was a broken man. Born on the brutal world of Nuceria, Angron had been subjected to the most horrific of experiences. He was raised in the gladiatorial pits where he was forced to fight and kill for the amusement of his captors. His early life was nothing but suffering, and this pain would mark him for the rest of his existence. Angron's life was defined by violence. His only family were the other gladiators he fought alongside. His only companions were the echoes of pain and death that surrounded him in the arena. When the Emperor found him, he sought to bring Angron into the fold of the Imperium as a leader of men. But Angron was already consumed by his rage, and when the Emperor attempted to remove the butcher's nails, the psychic implants designed to amplify his rage, he found that the damage had already been done. The nails had already driven Angron into a state of madness, stripping him of the ability to feel any emotion but rage. The butcher's nails are central to understanding why the World Eaters still hear Angron's screams. These devices, which were implanted in Angron's skull, were meant to control him, to make him a more effective weapon. They amplified his anger, pushed him to fight with an intensity and ferocity that was unmatched. The Emperor, in his desire to use Angron as a tool of war, failed to realize the true cost of these implants. Angron was no longer the man he once was. The butcher's nails had destroyed his humanity, leaving him a broken and tortured soul. But this transformation did not only affect Angron. As the World Eaters' Legion grew, the same fate befell them. The butcher's nails became an integral part of the World Eaters' identity, a symbol of their bond to Angron. For the World Eaters, the butcher's nails were not just tools of war. They were chains that bound them to their Primarch. With every battle, with every strike of their weapons, the World Eaters felt the nails drive deeper into their skulls, pushing them further into madness. The pain that Angron felt was now their pain, and the rage that consumed him consumed them as well. They became more than just soldiers. They became extensions of Angron's fury, unable to escape the ever-present torment that echoed through their minds. It was in this agony that the World Eaters found their identity. They were warriors of rage, bound to their Primarch by the unbreakable link of shared suffering. The screams of Angron became more than just a distant memory. They were a constant presence in the minds of the World Eaters. The screams were not just the cries of a tortured Primarch. They were a reflection of the pain that the World Eaters themselves experienced. Each battle, each victory, each act of violence became a way to drown out the screams, if only for a moment. The World Eaters did not fight for glory, or for honor, or for the Imperium. They fought to silence the agony that echoed through their skulls. But no matter how many enemies they killed, no matter how much blood they spilled, the screams of Angron never ceased. They were always there, a constant reminder of the price of their devotion. This bond between the World Eaters and Angron was not just a matter of loyalty or honor, it was a psychic connection that tied their very souls together. The Butcher's nails, while originally intended to control Angron, had instead created a psychic resonance between him and his warriors. The nails were not just physical devices, they were conduits of psychic power, linking the minds of the World Eaters to their Primarch. As the World Eaters fought and bled in the name of their father, the psychic connection between them and Angron grew stronger. The screams that they heard were not just echoes, they were part of the shared experience of suffering that defined the Legion. But it was not just the nails or the psychic resonance that kept Angron's screams alive in the minds of the World Eaters. The very nature of their existence as warriors of Khorne was bound to the never-ending cycle of rage and violence. Khorne, the blood god, demands bloodshed and destruction, and the World Eaters, in their devotion to him, became instruments of his will. But this devotion came at a cost. The World Eaters were not simply warriors, they were sacrifices to the blood god, constantly offering up their blood and souls in exchange for his favor. And in this twisted ritual, they could not escape the influence of Angron. The screams of their Primarch were a part of their devotion, a constant reminder of the price of their worship. In the heat of battle, the World Eaters could hear the screams of Angron more clearly than ever. The bloodshed, the carnage, the endless slaughter, it all became a way to drown out the pain that pulsed in their minds. But the screams of Angron were not just a reminder of their torment. They were a reminder of their purpose. The World Eaters fought not for victory, but for the blood of their enemies, for the blood of their own comrades, and for the blood of their Primarch. Their rage was no longer just an instinct, it was a sacred duty, a ritual that tied them to their father and to the blood god. And as they fought, they could hear Angron's screams, a war hymn that drove them to ever greater acts of violence. But even after the Horus Heresy, when Angron was cast into the warp and became a demon prince of Khorne, his screams did not cease. If anything, they grew louder. Angron's ascension to demonhood did not free him from his torment. It only intensified it. As a servant of Khorne, Angron was bound to the god of war, forever caught in a cycle of rage and bloodshed. His suffering became eternal, and with it the World Eaters' bond to him became unbreakable. The screams they heard were not just the cries of a Primarch, they were the cries of a god of blood and fury, whose power was forever intertwined with the World Eaters. The World Eaters have become creatures of rage, their minds and souls bound to the suffering of their Primarch. They cannot escape the screams of Angron, nor do they want to. In their madness, in their devotion to Khorne, they have found a purpose, a meaning that is rooted in their shared pain. The screams of Angron are not just a curse, they are a part of their identity, a reflection of their eternal bond to their Primarch. The World Eaters will never be free of his torment, and in this they find their strength. Their rage is their power, and their power is their curse. As long as the World Eaters live, they will continue to hear Angron's screams. It is a sound that defines them, that drives them, that binds them to their Primarch and to the endless cycle of war. The screams of Angron are not just the cries of a tortured soul, they are the cries of a legion that has lost its humanity, a legion that has become one with its rage. And no matter how far they roam across the stars, they will always hear those screams echoing through their minds, a reminder that they are never truly free. The World Eater's plight did not begin with the Horus heresy or even with Angron's arrival on the battlefield. No, their story starts with a much darker, more personal tragedy: the brutal fate of their Primarch, Angron. To understand why the World Eaters still hear his screams is to understand the deep spiritual and psychic bond that ties them to their father. This bond is more than just a leader's influence over his men. It is a raw, unbroken connection formed through suffering, rage, and the kind of pain that can only be experienced by those who are born into it. Angron's tragic story is one of slavery, betrayal, and brutality. He was taken from his homeworld of Nuceria as a child, a warrior born among the lowest of the low, and subjected to the horrors of the gladiatorial pits. His life was one of endless pain, driven by the endless need to fight and kill. The people who raised him saw only his potential as a weapon. His rage was their tool, and his blood was their profit. But Angron, for all his fury and resilience, was no mere tool. The butcher's nails, the psychic implants that would define his life, were forced into his skull to control him and amplify his rage. These nails drove him to madness, and in doing so, destroyed any semblance of the man he might have been. When the Emperor found Angron, he sought to save him. The Emperor's vision for Angron was one of nobility and honor, a warrior leading his men in battle to bring the light of the Imperium to distant stars. But Angron was beyond saving. His mind, ravaged by the nails and his years of suffering, rejected the Emperor's vision. His rage, his endless torment, became his entire being. The butcher's nails, once an instrument of control, had turned Angron into something far worse, a living embodiment of rage, and it was this rage that would bind him forever to the World Eaters. The World Eaters, as they followed Angron, became mirrors of their Primarch. They too were implanted with the butcher's nails, each one a piece of the legacy of suffering that Angron carried with him. The nails were more than just tools of war, they were tools of torment, and with them came the screams of their creator. These screams, at first faint and distant, grew louder as the World Eaters fought in Angron's name. Every battle they fought, every enemy they slaughtered, fed their rage and drew them closer to the maddening echo of Angron's pain. They became not just soldiers, but extensions of their Primarch's agony, and the nails inside their heads made sure they could never escape it. The butcher's nails were not a mere mechanical device. They were a psychic link, a conduit between Angron and his warriors. Every battle, every drop of blood spilled, reverberated across this link, reinforcing the bond between the World Eaters and their Primarch. And with every passing moment, the screams of Angron grew louder, as though the very soul of the World Eaters was entwined with his. The pain that consumed Angron became the same pain that consumed his warriors. It was a shared madness, a shared destiny, forged in the fires of the gladiatorial pits and the blood-soaked battlefields of the Imperium. As the World Eaters became more brutal, more savage, they began to lose themselves in the bloodlust that had been cultivated by their Primarch. Their identity was no longer their own. It was defined by the rage that tore through their bodies, that burned through their minds. The butcher's nails amplified this rage, and the more they fought, the more they could hear Angron's screams. These weren't just the cries of a tortured soul, they were the cries of a legion in agony, the sound of every World Eater slowly losing his humanity. They were no longer men, they were vessels of rage, tools of destruction, and their minds were forever bound to Angron's torment. The Horus heresy would come, and with it, the final betrayal. The World Eaters, led by Angron, would turn against the Imperium, their loyalty torn between their Primarch and the promises of chaos. The butcher's nails, those horrific devices, would ensure that the World Eaters never wavered in their rage. Angron's influence was absolute. But even as they joined the forces of chaos, even as they fell into the dark embrace of Khorne, the screams of Angron never stopped. If anything, they grew louder. In the warp, Angron became a demon prince, a servant of Khorne, the blood god. His suffering, once a private torment, became a cosmic force, a presence that echoed throughout the realms of chaos. The World Eaters, now fully part of the Chaos Legion, found themselves more deeply connected to Angron than ever before. His pain, his rage, became a part of their souls. And yet, despite the passage of time, despite the World Eaters' fall into chaos, the bond between them and Angron remains unbroken. The screams that once filled their minds are now a constant presence, a reminder of their origins and their curse. The World Eaters still hear Angron's pain, still feel his suffering, because it is a part of them. It is not just the agony of a Primarch, it is the agony of a legion. The World Eaters are Angron, and Angron is the World Eaters. They are bound to him by the butcher's nails, by their loyalty to Khorne, and by the shared torment that defines their very existence. There is no escaping this curse. The World Eaters cannot rid themselves of the screams, for they are the manifestation of their devotion. They are creatures of blood and rage, and as long as they live, they will hear the echoes of Angron's suffering. It is a torment they will never escape, and it is a torment they can never deny. They have become creatures of the warp, warped by their rage and bound to the eternal cycle of violence. The screams of Angron are a reminder of the price of their devotion, a price they will continue to pay for as long as they exist. For the World Eaters, the screams of Angron are not just the cries of a tortured Primarch. They are the cries of a legion that has lost its soul, that has become nothing more than an instrument of rage. And no matter how far they roam, no matter how many battles they fight, they will never escape those screams. They will carry them with them, as they carry the butcher's nails for the rest of their days. It is their curse, their legacy, and their bond to the one they call Father. And they will hear his screams for all eternity, echoing in their minds as a reminder of the true cost of their loyalty to Angron and the Blood God. The World Eaters' fate is inextricably linked to the screams of their Primarch, Angron. This torment does not come from a simple bond of loyalty, nor does it merely represent the tragedies of their past. The World Eaters are more than just soldiers who follow a warlord. They are forever bound to the agony of a being who was once a man, but was transformed by unimaginable suffering. That suffering is now their shared inheritance. Angron's screams are not just echoes of past pain, but a psychic chain that ties his warriors to him, and through him, to the ever-growing madness that defines the World Eaters. Angron's transformation from the gladiator slave of Nuceria into the Primarch of the World Eaters was not merely a fall. It was a process of evolution, fueled by violence and despair. The world of Nuceria upon which Angron was raised was a place where life was cheap and pain was endless. Angron's earliest memories were shaped by the brutal training and the slaughter of countless others in the blood-soaked pits of the arena. But what was truly tragic was that he never had the opportunity to embrace any other identity, nor the chance to become anything more than a weapon. The butcher's nails, which were forcibly embedded into his skull by his captors, were not merely a tool of control. They were an attempt to turn him into a berserk killing machine, amplifying his rage and stripping away his humanity. These nails, designed to eliminate any trace of empathy or compassion, had a profound effect not only on Angron himself, but also on the legion that would follow him. When the Emperor of Mankind found Angron, he attempted to free him from the nails, but the damage had already been done. Angron's mind was ravaged by rage and madness, and his original identity, however brief or faint, was obliterated. This despair would be passed down to his sons, the World Eaters, who would inherit not just his leadership, but the same curse. For the World Eaters, the butcher's nails became a symbol of their destiny. Each new recruit, each new warrior, was subjected to the same horrific procedure. These nails were implanted in their skulls to ensure that their loyalty to Angron, and through him to Khorne, was unshakable. But while these devices were meant to ensure compliance and obedience, they did something far worse. They forged a psychic connection between the World Eaters and their Primarch. This connection was not a bond of love or admiration. It was a chain of suffering. The nails amplified their rage and brought them ever closer to their father's fate, endless, unrelenting pain. And it was in this rage that the World Eaters heard Angron's screams. At first, the screams were distant, but as the nails took hold and their minds began to unravel, the cries grew louder. The torment of their Primarch became their own, transmitted through the psychic resonance of the nails and through the shared trauma of their upbringing. As each World Eater fell deeper into his madness, As he reveled in bloodshed and destruction, the screams that filled their minds became louder, more insistent. They were not just fighting for Khorne. They were fighting to drown out the torment that had come to define their existence. In battle, the World Eaters could hear Angron's cries with a clarity that cut through the fog of bloodlust. Each kill, each brutal act of violence, became an attempt to silence that anguish, if only for a brief moment. But it never ended. The screams would not stop. The madness would not subside. Each battle, each moment of bloodshed, only deepened their connection to Angron, and each echo of his pain was a reminder that they were forever lost, forever trapped in the cycle of violence that had begun long before the Emperor's arrival on Nuceria. The Horus Heresy marked the World Eaters' ultimate fall into madness. No longer content with fighting for the Imperium, they followed Angron into the embrace of chaos. Angron's transformation into a demon prince of Khorne did little to ease his torment. In fact, it only amplified it. As a servant of Khorne, Angron's suffering became eternal, a perpetual reminder of the cost of his pact with the Blood God. His screams became the soundtrack of the World Eater's existence, ever present and ever consuming. The more the World Eaters followed him, the more they were bound to his pain. The relationship between Angron and his legion was not one of reverence or respect. It was one of shared suffering. The World Eaters were not just loyal soldiers, they were extensions of Angron's wrath. They had become as much a part of his agony as he was. Even after the heresy, even after their fall into the depths of chaos, the World Eaters' connection to their Primarch remained unbroken. Angron's pain became their guiding force, their reason for existence. As they slaughtered in the name of Khorne, they could not escape the agony that defined their existence. It was a brutal and tragic cycle. The more they fought, the more they fed their rage, the more they heard Angron's screams. The screams are not just the echoes of a Primarch's suffering. They are the cries of a legion lost to the madness that their father had experienced. The World Eaters, who once might have been men, have now become creatures of pure rage, driven by the same torment that consumed Angron. They fight not to conquer, not to claim victory, but to drown out the never-ending agony that echoes through their minds. The screams of Angron are no longer just sounds. They are the very essence of the World Eaters' existence. They are both their curse and their purpose. In the darkness of the warp, the World Eaters fight, their rage undying, their connection to Angron as strong as ever. They are bound to him by the butcher's nails, by their devotion to Khorne, and by the torment that has shaped their very being. The screams of Angron are not just a reminder of their past. They are the sound of their future, a future that can never be free of the agony that has come to define them. And as long as the World Eaters continue to fight, as long as they continue to serve the Blood God, the screams of Angron will echo in their minds, a constant reminder of the price of their loyalty and the cost of their rage. The World Eaters, as a legion, are driven by bloodlust, an uncontrollable rage that defines their every action. But beneath this insatiable thirst for carnage lies a darker, far more tragic connection. The unyielding screams of Angron, their Primarch, echoing through their minds. These screams, a manifestation of his eternal suffering, are not only a sign of their torment, but also a reflection of their shared fate. The World Eaters are cursed, bound by a chain of madness and pain that links them directly to Angron. His pain is their pain, and no matter how far they may roam across the galaxy, they will always hear his agony. To understand why the World Eaters still hear Angron's screams, we must first understand the man, or rather the monster, who would become their father. Angron was not always the towering figure of rage and destruction that he is remembered as today. In his earlier life, before his ascension to demonhood, Angron was a gladiator, born in the brutal world of Nuceria. His earliest memories were filled with the screams of his fellow slaves and the brutality of endless bloodshed. Raised in an arena of suffering, Angron was forged in the fires of violence, much as his warriors would later be. But it was not always this way. In his youth, he was a man of honor and pride, but his true nature was twisted by the cruel experiments of his captors. The butcher's nails, those horrific devices implanted in Angron's skull, would define his destiny. These nails, designed to amplify his rage and strip him of any remaining humanity, became his prison. His mind was enslaved by the ceaseless pounding of the nails, driving him into an unrelenting frenzy of violence. They took a once noble warrior and transformed him into a living embodiment of rage, incapable of finding peace or solace. This torment was not just a physical burden, it was a mental and emotional affliction that would scar him for the rest of his existence. But the true horror of the Butcher's Nails was not just in what they did to Angron, but what they would come to represent for his legion. When the Emperor found Angron, he sought to free him, to bring him into the fold of the Imperium as a leader of men. But Angron's fury, amplified by the Butcher's Nails, rejected any attempt at salvation. The nails, rather than being removed, became a symbol of his unbreakable connection to the pain and fury that had defined his existence. And from that moment on, they would bind him not only to his past, but also to his future, and to the fate of the World Eaters. For the World Eaters, the Butcher's Nails were more than just tools of war. They were chains, binding them to a destiny of endless bloodshed and madness. Angron's pain, amplified by the nails, became their pain. As the World Eaters were shaped by their Primarch's rage, they too became slaves to the Butcher's Nails, and with them came the ever-present echoes of Angron's torment. The nails transformed the World Eaters into more than just soldiers. They became extensions of Angron's agony. They were not merely following their Primarch into battle, they were joining him in his endless suffering. And it was through this shared experience that the World Eaters came to hear Angron's screams. The Butcher's Nails were not just devices that twisted the minds of the World Eaters. They were conduits of a psychic resonance that linked the warriors to their Primarch. This bond was more than just a physical one. It was a spiritual and psychic connection that tied them to Angron's suffering. As the nails dug deeper into their skulls, the World Eaters felt Angron's agony as if it were their own. His pain became theirs, and the screams that echoed in their minds were not merely distant memories. They were a living, breathing presence, forever intertwined with their existence. The connection between the World Eaters and Angron was not just a bond of loyalty. It was a bond forged in pain. The screams of Angron, as he was driven mad by the Butcher's Nails, were the foundation of the World Eaters' identity. As the warriors of the World Eaters gave themselves over to their Primarch's will, they also gave themselves over to the pain that defined him. The screams became a constant presence in their lives, a reminder that they could never escape the madness that had consumed their father. And as they fought, the screams only grew louder. In battle, the World Eaters could hear the screams of their Primarch more clearly than ever. The bloodshed, the slaughter, the chaos of war, it all became a means of drowning out the pain that filled their minds. But no matter how many enemies they killed, no matter how much blood they spilled, the screams of Angron never ceased. They were always there, a constant reminder of the torment that had shaped them, that defined them. And for the World Eaters, the battle was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight to silence the screams. They fought not for glory, not for honor, but to quell the unrelenting noise of Angron's agony, even if only for a fleeting moment. The screams were not just a reminder of Angron's torment, they were a reminder of the World Eaters' own fate. As long as they wore the Butcher's Nails, as long as they followed Angron, they would never escape his pain. They were forever bound to it, and they could never find peace. Even in the heat of battle, when they reveled in the violence and destruction, the screams would echo in their minds. They were not just fighting for Khorne. They were fighting to appease the unrelenting agony that they shared with their Primarch. The World Eaters' transformation during the Horus Heresy sealed their fate. As they turned against the Imperium, their bond to Angron and his pain grew even stronger. His suffering, now eternal as a demon prince of Khorne, was woven into the very fabric of their existence. The more they fought for Khorne, the more they gave themselves over to the pain that had shaped their Primarch's existence. The screams, which had once been the cries of a tortured man, became the screams of a god, and the World Eaters were bound to them forever. Angron's torment had become their own. Today, even after the fall of the Imperium and the ascension of Angron to the warp, the World Eaters continue to hear his screams. They are no longer just the cries of a Primarch, They are the cries of a legion that has lost its soul. The World Eaters are no longer men, but creatures of rage and madness, bound to the endless cycle of violence that their Primarch began. The screams of Angron are no longer just an echo of the past. They are a permanent part of the World Eaters' identity. And as long as they continue to fight, as long as they continue to serve Khorne, they will never be free of Angron's suffering. They are forever bound to his pain, and the screams will echo in their minds for all eternity. Angron's existence, both as a man and as a Primarch, is defined by one singular force: rage. This overwhelming emotion, which he was first forced to channel as a gladiator in the brutal arenas of Nuceria, became his entire being. To understand why the World Eaters still hear his screams, we must first explore the depth of Angron's transformation, how the violence he endured turned him into the living embodiment of fury, and how the Butcher's nails would become the very tools that forged his connection with his sons. Born into the pits of Nuceria, Angron's life was a horrific series of battles for survival, forced into bloodshed by the cruel rulers of his world. He was raised as a gladiator, forced to fight for sport in front of an audience that saw him only as a weapon. His memories are tainted by the brutality of these fights, the constant agony of being shackled in an arena where death was as certain as the rising sun. Angron's spirit, despite the torture he endured, was fierce. However, his captors understood his potential for defiance and sought to break him, to turn him into something that could not resist. To that end, they subjected him to the Butcher's nails, terrible devices implanted in his skull, designed to amplify his rage and remove any sense of compassion, rendering him a creature of pure aggression. But the nails did not just create a savage monster, they shattered Angron's humanity. The implants rendered him a mere vessel of rage, unable to feel anything other than an insatiable need to destroy. His mind became unmoored from the world of reason, trapped in a constant state of fury. The pain from the Butcher's nails echoed in every fiber of his being, yet his torment only fueled his ability to fight. He became a force of nature, unstoppable in his destruction, but he also became a broken man. The horrors he experienced under the nails' influence would resonate throughout his existence, but it was not just Angron who would suffer this fate. When the Emperor found Angron, he saw a broken man and sought to bring him into the fold of the Imperium. Angron, however, was beyond the Emperor's reach. His rage, made unbearable by the Butcher's nails, blinded him to any hope of redemption. Angron could no longer be the noble, heroic figure the Emperor envisioned. Instead, he rejected the Emperor's attempts at healing, choosing instead to embrace the rage that was his only constant companion. In this choice, Angron condemned himself to an existence of unending torment. The Butcher's nails were now as much a part of him as his own flesh, and they served as a constant reminder of the price he had paid for survival. For the World Eaters, their bond to Angron was sealed when they too were subjected to the Butcher's nails. The Emperor's vision for Angron was one of ability and glory, but for the World Eaters, it was a different story. The World Eaters were not crafted to be champions of humanity. They were created as instruments of destruction, and the Butcher's nails would serve to bind them forever to the fury that defined their Primarch. These warriors, upon becoming a part of Angron's legion, were not merely soldiers. They were extensions of his pain. The nails, implanted in their skulls, were not just tools of control, they became a conduit for Angron's suffering. And as they fought and bled, the World Eaters would hear his torment echo in their minds. The psychological resonance of the Butcher's nails ensured that Angron's pain would never be a distant memory for the World Eaters. His suffering became a shared experience. Every act of violence, every kill, every drop of blood spilled by the World Eaters resonated with Angron's torment. They fought not just for conquest, not just for glory, but to silence the agony that lived within their minds. The Butcher's nails made sure that Angron's suffering was never forgotten. His pain became their own, and through the screams they heard, they could feel his eternal torment. As the World Eaters fought on, the battlefields became places where the cries of Angron mixed with the war cries of his sons. These screams were not only the cries of a tortured Primarch, they were the cries of a legion bound by shared suffering, by shared fury. The World Eaters were not simply Angron's soldiers. They were reflections of him, reflections of his rage and his pain. Every victory, every conquest, was tied to the echoes of those screams, and as the World Eaters surged into battle, they sought to drown them out with bloodshed. But the screams would never cease. The more they fought, the more they became ensnared in Angron's torment. The Horus heresy marked the World Eaters' full descent into madness. As Angron's rage consumed him, so too did it consume his warriors. They followed him into the embrace of chaos, fully aware that they were no longer fighting for the Emperor or the Imperium, but for Khorne, the Blood God. The World Eaters had become creatures of rage, and their devotion to Khorne only served to amplify that rage. But even as they became servants of Khorne, the screams of Angron did not fade. They intensified. In the warp, where time and space bend to the will of the Chaos Gods, Angron was transformed into a demon prince of Khorne. His suffering, which had been his defining characteristic, now became eternal. His torment was no longer confined to the physical realm. It reverberated throughout the immaterium, and the World Eaters could hear it more clearly than ever. The Butcher's nails were still embedded in their skulls, driving them to ever greater heights of violence, but they were also a constant connection to Angron's endless agony. The World Eaters were no longer just his warriors. They were extensions of his wrath, extensions of his suffering. The bond between Angron and the World Eaters became even more deeply entrenched. The World Eaters' loyalty to their Primarch was not based on love or respect. It was based on shared pain. Their identity had become intertwined with Angron's torment, and the screams they heard were a constant reminder of that bond. It was a bond that would never be severed, no matter how far they roamed across the galaxy, no matter how many battles they fought. Angron's suffering would always be with them, a permanent part of their psyche. Even in the present day, as the World Eaters continue to wreak havoc in the name of Khorne, Angron's screams are ever present. The Legion's descent into madness is a direct consequence of their devotion to their Primarch, and the torment that he endured continues to shape their very being. For the World Eaters, there is no escape from Angron's pain. They will always hear his cries, always feel the weight of his suffering as long as they exist. And in this shared agony, they find their purpose. It is a purpose defined not by glory or honor, but by rage, by blood, and by the eternal screams of their Primarch, whose suffering is their own. As the World Eaters followed Angron deeper into the embrace of Khorne, their transformation from a legion of warriors into creatures of pure rage was solidified. They were no longer mere soldiers. They were embodiments of the endless bloodshed that their Primarch had come to represent. The echoes of Angron's agony and the overwhelming need to appease the Blood God would drive them to commit acts of savagery so horrific that even the galaxy's most hardened of warriors would shudder at their brutality. This section will explore the deeper psychological and spiritual changes that took place within the World Eaters as they succumbed to their fate and fully embraced the God of War. The World Eaters' path to madness was a gradual process that began long before the heresy. The seeds were planted when Angron first met the Emperor, and they were watered by the Butcher's nails, the psychic devices that turned the Primarch into an unstoppable machine of fury. These nails were originally used as a tool to control and manipulate Angron, pushing him to fight with incredible strength and rage. But the nails did far more than that. They stripped Angron of his humanity, turning him into an uncontrollable beast, disconnected from any higher purpose or sense of morality. His only goal became the endless fight for survival, the constant need to battle for dominance. This transformation into a being of rage would become the foundation of the World Eaters' identity. Initially, the World Eaters had been an elite legion, champions of the Emperor. But they were soon overwhelmed by the same bloodlust that consumed their Primarch. As the Butcher's nails were implanted in their own skulls, the transformation took hold. Angron's fury became theirs. His pain became their pain, and his endless torment echoed through their minds. They were no longer men. They had become extensions of their father's agony. Their souls were enslaved to the unending war and the promise of death. With each passing battle, the World Eaters grew more brutal and more disconnected from the concept of honor. The war cries of Khorne, the blood god, had become their mantra. Khorne demands blood, and the World Eaters gave it in abundance. The battlefields they tore through were littered with the remains of those who stood in their way. But this was not enough. The screams of Angron, which had once echoed faintly in their minds, now roared as loudly as the noise of war itself. The World Eaters fought not only to please their god, but also to silence the relentless pain they shared with their Primarch. The violence they waged was no longer just a means to an end. It was a desperate attempt to drown out the psychic scream that was ingrained in their every moment of existence. The madness that consumed the World Eaters was not just a result of their physical and psychic transformation. It was deeply spiritual as well. The worship of Khorne, the blood god, was an all-consuming devotion that reshaped them from the inside out. Khorne demands bloodshed, war, and conflict, and the World Eaters became the perfect instrument of his will. There was no room for mercy, no place for remorse, and no hope for redemption. The World Eaters were no longer bound to the Emperor's ideals of duty and honor. They were now bound to Khorne's relentless cycle of violence. And this violence was not just external. It consumed them from within. Every moment of bloodshed they caused was another piece of their soul offered up to Khorne, and the price was steep. For all their strength and savagery, the World Eaters were forever bound to the torment of their Primarch, whose pain and agony echoed through their minds in an eternal reminder of the cost of their devotion. It is here that the true horror of the World Eaters lies. Their battle is never just with their enemies. It is with themselves. They are locked in an eternal struggle to suppress their humanity, to embrace the unrelenting bloodlust that defines them. This internal battle only amplifies their madness, creating a vicious cycle of rage and despair. The screams of Angron become the soundtrack to their endless struggle, a reminder that no matter how many enemies they slay or how many battles they win, they will never be free of the torment that haunts them. Every victory is fleeting. Every kill only deepens their curse. Their fall into chaos and their devotion to Khorne did not release them from the agony that defines them. It deepened it. The transformation was complete. The World Eaters were no longer the proud, noble warriors they might have been, but were now the champions of Khorne, bound to the eternal war and suffering that the god demanded. They became as much a part of Angron's agony as he had been, and through their devotion to Khorne, they hoped to gain the strength to survive, if only for a moment, the screaming pain that constantly tore at their souls. In the end, they were not free from their suffering. They became the very embodiment of it. The World Eaters' worship of Khorne became their purpose. The battle cries of their warband echoed with the blood-soaked promises of their god. Their identity was forged in the heat of battle, and their spiritual connection to Khorne deepened with each new act of violence. But even as they fought to please their god, the screams of Angron would never leave them. Every step they took in their new path, every kill they made, every act of bloodshed was a reflection of the legacy that their Primarch had left them. The World Eaters had become more than just a legion. They had become the embodiment of Khorne's will and Angron's suffering. Their battles were no longer simply about victory. It was about appeasing the thirst for blood that could never be satisfied. Their existence had become a never-ending cycle of violence and pain, with no hope for peace or redemption. The screams of Angron, forever trapped in their minds, served as a constant reminder that no matter how far they roamed across the galaxy, no matter how many foes they slaughtered, they would never escape the torment they had inherited from their father. In the end, the World Eaters' devotion to Khorne and their bond with Angron had forever marked them. The war they waged was not just against their enemies. It was a war against the suffering that defined their very existence. The World Eaters would fight, and they would kill, and they would do so in the name of Khorne, forever bound by the agony of their Primarch, forever hearing his screams, echoing in the deepest recesses of their minds. This was their curse, and it would be their legacy. The madness that consumes the World Eaters is not just a result of their loyalty to Khorne or the Butcher's Nails. Their descent into chaos is deeply tied to the legacy of their Primarch, Angron, whose endless suffering and rage have shaped them into the warriors they are today. To fully understand why the World Eaters continue to hear Angron's screams, we must look into how his curse, combined with their devotion to the blood god, has distorted their psyche and sense of identity. Angron's transformation into a demon prince of Khorne did not bring relief or respite from the suffering he endured throughout his mortal life. If anything, it only intensified the torment that had once been contained within his mind. As a demon prince, Angron was elevated to an immortal servant of the blood god, but this promotion came at an unimaginable cost. His rage, once a product of his torment and shackled by the butcher's nails, was now given free rein, and his endless agony was amplified in the warp. The eternal screams of his pain were not erased by his ascension. Instead, they became part of the immaterium, a source of cosmic power that reverberated across the galaxies. Angron's eternal suffering was now woven into the very fabric of the chaos that defined Khorne's realm. The World Eaters, as loyal servants of Khorne, are not exempt from this. Their connection to their Primarch is not severed by his ascension into demonhood. If anything, it becomes stronger. The World Eaters' bond to Angron is not just spiritual, it is psychic, a tether that binds them to the screams that echo in the warp. Every time they fight, every time they spill blood in Khorne's name, they are reminded of their Primarch's eternal torment. His suffering is no longer just an echo, they can feel it, a constant presence in their minds, warping their thoughts and driving them to ever greater acts of violence. The screams that the World Eaters hear are not just the cries of a tortured Primarch. They are the sounds of their own inevitable fate. The butcher's nails are not just tools of war. They are shackles that bind the World Eaters to Angron's endless suffering. The nails, implanted in every warrior's skull, ensure that Angron's pain is never far from their minds. The psychic link between the World Eaters and their Primarch is so strong that even in the heat of battle, when blood and fury are at their peak, they cannot escape his screams. Every swing of their chainswords, every decapitation, is an attempt to drown out the voices, but they cannot silence them. They are trapped in a cycle, ever spiraling downward, ever feeding the hunger for violence, and ever haunted by Angron's cries. This psychic connection is not just a byproduct of their transformation into warriors of Khorne. It is a curse, one that has defined the World Eaters since their inception. Their very existence is entwined with the pain of their Primarch. Angron's rage is their rage. His torment is their torment. When they are in the throes of battle, when they are lost in the bloodshed of war, they are not simply fighting for survival. They are fighting to escape the psychological imprisonment that their loyalty to Khorne and Angron has bound them to. The more blood they spill, the deeper they sink into the abyss, unable to break free from the curse they have inherited. This connection to Angron and the torment that it brings is also what keeps the World Eaters from ever truly finding peace. They are forever bound to their Primarch's pain, and this pain becomes the driving force behind everything they do. They are not fighting for glory, for honor, or for any noble cause. They are fighting to suppress the screams of Angron in their minds. They are fighting to feed the rage that fuels them, to silence the ever-present echoes of agony that threaten to drown them. But no matter how much blood they spill, no matter how many enemies they butcher, the screams will never cease. Angron's torment is infinite, and so too is their suffering. The World Eaters have become nothing more than vessels of destruction. They are driven by an insatiable need to fight and kill, but they are never truly free. The endless cycle of violence and suffering that has come to define them is one they can never escape. Each battle they fight, each war they wage, is a reflection of the rage that consumes them. But it is also a reflection of the bond they share with their Primarch, a bond that will never be severed. The curse of the World Eaters is a tragic one. They are forever tied to Angron's eternal suffering, and they will never be free of it. Even in the heights of their rage, when the roar of battle drowns out everything else, the screams of Angron are ever present in their minds. They cannot escape their fate, and they cannot escape the torment of their Primarch. It is a fate they have embraced, and it is one that will shape them for as long as they exist. This, then, is why the World Eaters still hear Angron's screams. It is not simply because of their loyalty to him, nor is it solely due to their devotion to Khorne. it is because their very souls are bound to his torment. They are the sons of Angron, cursed to carry his pain and rage with them for all eternity. And in that eternal agony, they find their purpose: to fight, to kill, and to forever seek to drown out the cries of their Primarch, knowing they will never succeed. This is the fate of the World Eaters. Their legacy is bound in blood and torment, and their screams will echo across the galaxy for as long as they endure. As the World Eaters continue their endless war, so too does the legacy of Angron's torment persist, echoing across the stars. And if you've enjoyed delving into this dark chapter of Warhammer 40k, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more insights into the grim darkness of the far future.